But I'm a big believer in if you buy things that work with long-term financing in place, then you'll be fine no matter what happens in the market. I mean, you have to have adequate cash reserves, obviously, because you can have a reduction in cash flow. But if you have a positive cash flowing asset with long-term financing and a reasonable cash reserve, you can pretty much survive any part of the market.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Workergenics Mastermind podcast. Today we have special guest Jeff Holst, who many refer to him as the most interesting man in the world. He is a recovering attorney, a real estate investor, an author, public speaker, and many other things, world traveler. It's an honor to have Jeff on the show and learn a little bit about his mindset tips for entrepreneurs and investors. Welcome, Jeff.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate you having me on. I connected with you guys here in Chattanooga a few years ago, and we really haven't had very much time to talk, although I did run into you in Puerto Rico not that long ago. That was fun.
Yeah, it's our world travels and living abroad has connected us in many different ways. So it's great catching up to you. Just happenstance at a pizza place there. And I think you have like a cigar business.
So I'm from Michigan originally, but I'm in Chattanooga about half the time, and I'm in Puerto Rico about half the time. It's probably more like 40 and 40 because the rest is just random travel, But so I keep an apartment in Puerto Rico, and we started a couple of businesses in Puerto Rico now. One is the cigar line. The pizza place that I saw you at is actually at a tobacco farm. And an organic vegetables and fruit farm as well. And so we were there meeting with the people that roll our cigars, and I happened to see you and your wife and children there. And I thought that was a weird coincidence because it's kind of in the middle of nowhere, Puerto Rico, right? Like this is not a touristy spot. We don't normally see non-tourists there.
Yeah, we were on a little fact-finding mission in Puerto Rico to see if it's someplace we might want to live in the future. They've got great tax incentives for entrepreneurs and investors. And so we were definitely going off the beaten path for what tourists typically see to see if it's
home. Well, and I love that because I love Puerto Rico. So like most people assume I'm there for the taxes, but I'm a multifamily real estate investor. So since 2017, we haven't really had to pay tax. If you bought enough multifamily, you had a lot of carry forward depreciation. So I've never bothered to change my residence. I'm still a resident of Tennessee. That could change in the future if like we start selling a lot of cigars because there's, incentives to be there if your income is generated there. And then also like we have another business we started there. We're in the very early stages of, which is in manufacturing charter sailboats, like 60-foot, 70-foot sailing catamarans for the U.S. charter market. There's a couple of reasons why it makes sense to do it there, which is beyond the scope of this discussion. But the super short version is there's some regulations that prevent foreign vessels from being used for commercial purposes in the U.S. And Puerto Rico being part of the U.S. means if we build the boats there, they'll be available.
That's the Jones Act, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, right out of the gate, Jones Act compliant with a COI from the Coast Guard. So
that's awesome. Well, I want to step back real quick a little bit because I think if people hear a little bit about your background, they're going to appreciate more what you have to say with your mindset and ideas. And so maybe you could just give us the kind of Cliff Notes version of your story and what's brought you here.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in the Midwest, in Michigan, like I said, and my dad was a lawyer, so I went to law school. Like it was really that simple. Like I was like, oh, that makes sense. It works for my dad. Like that's what I'm going to do. I didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about it. I was drawn to law school because I wanted to make money. Turns out that's the absolute wrong reason to pick a career is that, it's a good way to make money. So I did that though. And, went through law school and I did fine. I graduated with honors early. In fact, I started a small law practice in Grand Rapids and I wasn't unhappy, right? But I wasn't fulfilled. And I knew that. So I was constantly reading about real estate investing and listening. Well, I don't know, podcasts back then, probably not so much, but I was listening to audiobooks. I was reading books about real estate. I was reading blogs and talking to people that had real estate investments. So I spent a lot of time thinking about real estate, really starting back when I was in high school, all the way through undergrad, grad school. I have an MBA also. But I just didn't take action on it. I just kept educating myself and saying, oh, someday I'm going to do this. Someday I'm going to do this. And in 2008, I was doing bankruptcy work. And for people who remember the Great Recession, that was a great time to be a bankruptcy attorney. We were really busy. In fact, from the first 8 months of 2008, I made more money than any time in my life before that. And then went on a vacation to Peru. And I came back from Peru feeling a little off, and I thought I'd pick something up in the rainforest. So I went to the ER. They did some routine blood work and found out that I had leukemia. So I ended up going from, a small but thriving practice with like television ads and phone book ads. I mean, it sounds crazy now, but back then we had the back page of the phone book. And I think our phone book ads were like 60,000 a year, so like $5,000 a month for phone book ads. And then the television ads and all this other stuff. But I went from that, and while I was in Peru, the other attorney that worked for me put in his 2-week notice. So I came back, down one attorney, and then I got diagnosed with leukemia a week later, and I went from 2 attorneys to 0 overnight. It drove me into personal bankruptcy in 2010. I couldn't do it anymore. I was too far in debt because of the phone book ads, right? Because if I didn't have the expenses of operating the business, I could have shut down. It would have been one thing, but I had to hire people to cover my existing caseload while I was in the hospital. I mean, I had some people that volunteered and did free work for me. I appreciated that. But in reality, if they hadn't done that, I would have just filed sooner, right? Like that just bought me some time while I wasn't sure what was going on. But as I went forward, it became real obvious that I was never going to dig out of this giant pit of $5,000 a week I was spending on various things with zero income coming in. So I was the bankruptcy attorney who went bankrupt, and I thought I got to do something completely different. So, and I still didn't know if I was going to live, right? I mean, I was like, wow, my leukemia seems to be responding to treatment, but I might not. So I realized I needed to figure out a better plan. And that's when I started buying real estate. So yeah, middle of the Great Recession, no money, terrible credit. I'm like, I got to figure out how to buy real estate. So we had to get real creative. And I think that was really a blessing in retrospect, because it caused me to be a lot more flexible in how I structure things, and caused me to be a lot more aggressive in my decision making. And as a result of that, I ended up, flash forward to, so bankrupt in 2010. By 2017, the company that I was working for, I took a job after my bankruptcy in Chattanooga. That's how I ended up in Chattanooga. Was getting sold to a bigger company, and I didn't want to be working for a publicly traded company. And I thought, well, I have 50-ish houses with one partner, and they were all free and clear because we'd done a lot of flipping and all kinds of stuff because I couldn't get credit, right? I mean, I was 5 years post bankruptcy. So I think I'll just take 6 months off and figure out what I'm going to do. And I never went back to work after that. Just went full-time real estate. I mean, I did work, I started buying more deals, started buying apartment buildings in 2017. And, we've bought several of those. So we have about 350 units of apartments and some industrial and some retail space. And I've done everything with partners. I mean, I am bankable now, I have traditional financing now, but it literally did take about almost 10 years to be able to get regular financing post bankruptcy.
Well, I wonder too, if you had jumped right in and done some of the strategies you were learning early on before the crash, like that might have, with those external forces, caused some of those investments to go bad as well. And so it could have been
could very well have. I'd like to think I'm a genius and I just timed the market, but the reality is I got sick when I got sick, and I started buying when I started buying. But I'm a big believer in, if you buy things that work with long-term financing in place, then you'll be fine no matter what happens in the market. I mean, you have to have adequate cash reserves, obviously, because you can have a reduction in cash flow. But if you have a positive cash flowing asset with long-term financing and a reasonable cash reserve, you can pretty much survive any part of the market. I mean, look, if someone bought a piece of real estate in 2006 and they had to sell in 2010, they didn't do very well. But if they bought in 2006 and now, 18 years later, they're selling, they did amazing.
Exactly.
So I mean, long term, this stuff is very, very forgiving. So that's my whole strategy: is I buy cash flow and I try to make sure I have long term debt in place. Which there are people that are struggling with that now because interest rates have gone up and they have adjustable rate mortgages and things like that. Especially in the commercial space, you see a lot of that, and we have a few that adjust. But we knew that going in, and we looked at them and said, okay, like, here's the realistic probabilities. Here's what it will look like. It'll still cover. And that's annoying when your payment goes up $2,000 a month on a building. And I just had that happen on one. But when you're cash flowing $10,000 a month, if it goes up $2,000, it's not great, but it's not a disaster either.
Exactly. Well, so I'm sure you had some really crazy like realizations and life changes during that time where you were going through bankruptcy, dealing with leukemia, and then started this whole new venture of doing real estate investing. Can you share like what are some of the things that you learned that other people might be able to think about or put into place for helping them
Yeah.
stay positive and overcoming those challenges?
Yeah, so I'll step back actually before I got diagnosed. So when I was 17, I made this decision to give up bad days. I was just like, it's hard to put myself back into my 17-year-old brain because, it's nearly 30 years ago now. I'm dating myself, but when I was 17, I wasn't happy. I was depressed. I don't know about clinically depressed. I have no way of knowing that. But I walked into a bathroom with a knife and put it against my wrist. So I was not in a great spot. And it was a serrated blade. And I think that was a great blessing. If it had been a sharp, unserrated blade, I might not be here. But the serrated blade hurt. When I tried to cut myself, I was like, this hurts. And I just started thinking like, I think this is a God thing more than anything, but I started thinking, why would you hurt yourself to avoid pain? That doesn't make sense. So I just threw the knife away. I literally, it was a Miracle Blade 2000, like a infomercial knife. And I wrote about this in my book and I never told anyone about it. Even when I was 17 to when I was like 42, no one knew about this, right? Just me. I'm the only one that ever knew about it until I published my book, No Bad Days, where I talked about how I made this change from, being depressed and being sad or whatever. I had broken up with my girlfriend who I thought I was going to marry. My parents were going through a divorce and it was all this trauma going on at once. And I just went, this is dumb. Like, you're young and healthy and live in a middle class family in America. Like, how bad can your life be? Like figure out how to resolve this. And so I just decided that day I was going to try to have a good day. And so I said, today's a good day out loud 10 times and threw the knife away. And I walked out of the bathroom. And then every time I saw a mirror for weeks, I would just say to myself, either in my head if I was with people or out loud if I was by myself, today's a good day. And one day I walked into a 7-Eleven, maybe like 2-3 months later. I don't know the exact day. I wish I'd written it down, right? But sometime around there, when I was a senior in high school, I walk into this 7-Eleven. The guy behind the counter says to me, "How you doing today?" And I go, "I never have bad days." And I went, "Holy poop, I never have bad days," And I realized I hadn't had a bad day in like a couple of months. And I haven't had a bad day since. I've had bad things happen to me. I've had challenging things happen to me a lot. Getting diagnosed with leukemia, it was so crazy. The night I was diagnosed, my brother left a wedding that he was at, came over to the hospital room, and he looked me in the eyes and he goes, "I bet today's a bad day." I'd already been like 13 years of no bad days at that point. It was like unbelievable to people when I would tell them I don't have bad days. They didn't believe it. Or they'd say things like, "It must be nice," or blah, 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 right? Whatever. But what has happened in the intervening time is it's become more and more common for people to accept that. And I think the reason for that is because it's just like the internet's different now. Like in 1994, when I was having this experience, or 95, whatever it was, man, this stuff didn't exist. Like, I didn't know who Tony Robbins was, right? Like, if I didn't read his book, I didn't know who it was, right? If there wasn't YouTube, like, I couldn't go watch affirmations. I mean, that's what I was doing, but I didn't know what an affirmation was, right? So it was one of those things where it was just complicated, right? It was one of those things where I was like, what is going on in the world that gets me to make this work? I had to do it all myself. And I wish I could say I'm a genius. I'm not. I just got lucky. I just said today's a good day enough times that it worked. And it turns out ever since then, I've been a big fan of people like Tony Robbins and affirmations and things like that. And I think they can be really useful. And I've spent now, since I got sick, when I realized, that it was unusual, like, it wasn't that my life was so good that kept me positive. It was this attitude that made me interpret the things happening to me. I mean, the way I look at it is good and bad stuff happens to everyone, probably every day. But somewhere in the world right now, someone's having the best day of their life. Somewhere else in the world, someone's having the worst day of their life. So the day, it's not good or bad. It's just how those individuals are receiving that day, how they're thinking about it, how they're perceiving it. Those are the things that control their experience. Their objective reality is actually a subjective experience. And once you realize that, it gives you a tremendous amount of power. There's I didn't know this at the time, but the quote from Hal Elrod, who's the guy who wrote Miracle Morning, and he said, the moment you take 100% responsibility for everything in your life is the moment you can change anything in your life.
It's ultimate freedom then.
Powerful, right? Like, it wasn't my fault that I had leukemia, but it was my responsibility to deal with it. How I dealt with it mattered. So I stayed positive. I asked the right questions to the doctors. I went and got second opinions where appropriate. And I was able to do that with a clear head because I didn't let the garbage that I was being assaulted with overwhelm me. And I think the reason I wasn't overwhelmed is because I had a positive attitude. So my number one 100% recommendation for all people is figure out how to find your way to happiness and joy and contentment, because it doesn't come from the external, it comes from the internal.
So do you have, I mean, I've heard a lot of people promote different kinds of affirmations. Do you stick with the, today is a good day, or have you added on to that since then? What do you recommend for other people to find their own
I
kind
think
of
everyone has to have what resonates with them. So for me, I actually think more like, I'm actually going to probably write a book about this someday, but if someone else hears this and they steal my book idea, it's cool, whatever. I have this idea, I call it hashtagification. So it's like an affirmation, but it's like a mental hashtag. So for me, no bad days is my hashtag in my brain. Something challenging happens and my brain goes, no bad days. I don't have bad days, right? Like, it's such a huge part of me. And it's about creating personally identifying statements. Like, I never have bad days is actually better than today's a good day, because I started with today's a good day, but now I say I never have bad days, or I say no bad days, or I try to identify myself as a person who doesn't have bad days. And I take it to the extreme. I recognize this. I wrote a book called No Bad Days, so that I'm so thoroughly associated with that like it's impossible for me not to lean into that. I have tattoos in 2 different languages on my arms that say no bad days. No dias malos and Hakuna sin kumbaya, which is Swahili for no bad days. That's how much I lean into it, right? So I think those internal hashtags or self-identifying statements are really important. I don't think it actually matters how you do it. It's about what resonates for you. So that's one of them. I mean, I have other ones too, but I think if you can take a more broad topic and distill it down into a hashtag or a simple phrase, it's actually better than a complicated affirmation.
What are some kind of, I guess, side effects, would you say, or like things for people to keep an eye out for when they are facing challenges? Like, what are some of those like mental strategies or tricks that can help you remember, like, I don't have bad days? I mean, sometimes when you're in the heat of the moment, a stressful situation, that, tough phone call or email comes in, how do you remember to stay in that state and respond accordingly instead of reacting?
Yeah. So, I mean, the starting point is it takes practice, right? Like, something really terrible happens to you today and you just decided 5 minutes ago you're not going to have bad days anymore. It's probably going to be hard, right? Like, if you've been doing it for 20 years, it gets a lot easier. It's like going to the gym and building the muscle, but there's real science behind this. Actually, I read this book a long time ago. I forget the professor that wrote it, but it was called Hardwiring Happiness. And it really helped me understand how this works from a biological perspective. The neural pathways in your brain that you use the most often become deeper grooves, and it makes it easier to fire neurons down those pathways. So much like we all have that friend who, no matter what good happens to him, he thinks of something bad that happens. It's because he's wired his brain to look for negative, right? I had a friend, I swear, if he had won the lottery on the way to work, but then stubbed his toe getting out of his car to cash the check to win the lottery, he would think he was having a bad day because he stubbed his toe.
He'd be complaining about all the taxes he's got to pay now to get all the
exactly. He's worried about all this stuff, and it's like, well, I'm going to get 20 million, but after tax it might only be 10 million, and now I have a stubbed toe. My whole life is ruined. And it's like, well, okay. But I mean, I'm just doing the opposite of that, right? Like, I practiced so long to look for positive that, like, I got diagnosed with melanoma a couple of years ago. Melanoma is not a great, it's a pretty bad form of skin cancer, the one that kills you. The other ones generally are pretty treatable, but if you get it early enough, you're probably fine. I mean, it's bad, but you can survive it if they take it out, right? And I got clear margins, so I'm good. But as soon as I was diagnosed, the very first thought I had was, oh man, 2 cancers, that can't be good. Because, you hear people beating one cancer, but usually when they start having multiple cancers, it's really bad. The second thought I had immediately after that was, this will make a good story on a podcast someday. Like, I'm like looking for the positive. So,
Yeah.
so to answer your question, and I mean, I know I've jumped around a little bit, but to get back to the point of the question is, I think that the secret is to remind yourself of the positives, to accept that all things happen for a reason. I always say, that for me, it's a God thing, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a universe thing. It could just be a whatever works for you thing. But for me, it's like everything works together to a divine plan. And I accept that whatever I'm going through right now is happening to me for a reason. It's not happening to me as much as it's happening for me. So I try to convert that to whatever's going on is happening for me. And by the way, whatever is going on is okay as a result of that, including the fact that I don't like what's going on. That's also okay. Right. So recognizing that it's okay to be frustrated, it's okay to be annoyed, it's okay to be angry about whatever's happening to you. But that feeling, well, that's okay, doesn't mean that you should bury your head in the sand and like hope it goes away. It means that you now have to take action. There's a quote that I love when it comes to this, and that is from Richard Branson. And he said the difference between successful people and those who never succeed is that successful people take action without all the possible information. And I've always loved that. That combined with a quote from the Dalai Lama about worrying. And when we take all three of these quotes together, right? So I first started with the Hal Elrod quote. Then we've got the quote from, who did I just quote? I lost my mind here. Well, whatever. The Dalai Lama, or the Richard Branson quote, and then the Dalai Lama quote. So the Dalai Lama said, it never makes sense to worry because either you can do something about it or you can't. And if you can do something about it, you're better off to just go do that. And if you can't, the worrying doesn't help. And that's kind of the other thing I think about is, the first reaction to negative stuff happening to me is I don't have bad days. So I need to figure out how to not have a bad day. I'm not going to let this ruin my day. That's the first reaction. The second reaction is, what can I do about it? If there's nothing I can do about it, then I don't need to spend effort on it. Right? So what can I do about it? Start thinking about what I can do about it and then take that action even before I get all the information, right? So what can I do about it? Take the action, move forward. And then the other thing I always remind myself when it's really hard is, and this is a mental affirmation that's really been powerful for me, and that is, I grow through the pain, I don't go through the pain.
Yeah,
So I always remind myself of that.
One thing that my wife and I always say is that everything that we're experiencing is ultimately for our benefit. And so if we look at a situation that comes our way, what can be learned from it? And sure, yeah, you can get frustrated in the moment, but then just switch that frustration to thinking about, what are we going to learn? What are we going to grow from this experience, and how much better life will be once we've realized that? And so it's like, try to, like you said, just focus on the positive, what you can learn from it, how you can grow. And I think that leads well into what you're talking about, how, achieving success. So that's kind of like the third area I wanted to talk to you on is, how do you use these mental tools and strategies and techniques to achieve success? Are there other, tricks in the toolbox that you like to share when it comes to like helping achieve your goals?
Yeah. So for me, I have this thing I call the extraordinary life formula, which is really a product of everything I've worked on since I was 17, all of the reading, all of the research, all of the coaching, all of the podcasts and YouTube videos. I synthesized it down to a very simple formula for an extraordinary life. And I actually believe everyone who lives an extraordinary life, and that's, not everyone, but a lot of people do. We've got tons of people that are, some of them we know, some of them we don't. It could be someone doing charity, but it could also be someone like Elon Musk, right? Like, it doesn't really matter. Like, people doing extraordinary things. I think they all use some variation of the same formula. And the formula is really just inspired thought plus the right action equals an extraordinary life. And so I break that down into two different things. So starting with inspired thought, I start under the premise that opportunities everywhere, but it doesn't knock. People always say opportunity knocks, but I don't think that's true. I think the opportunity is just out there waiting for us to grab it. And we have to first see that opportunity. Like we have to do the work to wake ourselves up and find that. So I have a couple of questions I ask myself about that. And I try to do this every single week, sometimes more than once a week. I ask myself 2 questions. The first question is, when is the last time you did something for the first time? When is the last time you did something for the first time? And I think that's really powerful because it causes you to try different things. And then the second part is a follow-up question to that is, what can I do right now or today or this week for the first time? And it can be something really simple, right? Stop at the Starbucks and talk to the barista instead of just like order your thing, like learn something from that person. Go a different route to work. That sounds goofy, but if you're in real estate like me, if you drive a different route to your office, you might see an opportunity that you didn't know was there. Go to a different restaurant, talk to a different person, listen to a different podcast, watch a different television show. It doesn't really matter. Like just something different because it's about waking yourself up. So what happens from a practical perspective, from psychology, we know we fall into something called the Iago trance, which is like when you brush your teeth and like you do all the same actions every day so often that you don't realize you're doing them, right? Like if I said to you, did you brush your teeth today? You're going to be like, yes. And I'm like, did you put water on your toothbrush? Well, you're traveling internationally, so you might remember this, right? Because you might be sufficiently out of your routine that you're like, oh yeah, I poured it off of the water bottle or whatever because I don't want to be exposed to the local water. But for most of us, we don't really remember, but we're going to say yes because we do it every day that way. We don't remember because we're in a trance while we're doing that. And it's very protective. It saves headspace for things that are important, but we also fall into that trance while we're driving to work, which is why I gave that example of driving a different route to work. We spend a lot of time in that trance where we're not really paying attention, where we're not seeing opportunity. And the secret is to wake yourself up from that. And you do that by exposing yourself to big ideas. So reading books by inspiring people, listening to podcasts, hearing what other people are doing, meeting new people. But whatever it is, it's about getting outside of the routine.
Yeah. I read a book, Outsmarting the Devil, recently, and they talk about people who are drifting. And it's a similar concept. Yeah. It's like, you got to get out of that routine. Like, the devil's greatest trick is like getting people into the routine of just drifting through life and not innovating. Yeah,
and I love that. Was it Outsmarting or Outwitting the Devil? Like Napoleon Hill book? Yeah. That's a really great book. I read that a few years ago. Yeah, so I think the thing about all this is it's about waking yourself up and seeing the opportunities that are there. And one way you can do it is by asking these empowering questions. Another way you can do it is just getting around inspiring people. So we try to create an environment for that, and the people that we hang out with when we do events or when we have our little mastermind, stuff like that. That's what we're going for. We're trying to create an inspiring environment for people. And I know that's what you're doing with your people as well. Like you're exposing them to big ideas. I think that's super, super valuable in the world. And so I recommend everyone continue to listen to your show because you're going to get ideas that you won't otherwise have. Yeah. And you can get these by going to conferences. You can get them by just going to networking events or meeting up with people. Or like I said, by talking to the barista. It doesn't actually matter. Right? You just don't know where the ideas are going to come from. So that's the first part of the formula. The second part of the formula is taking the right action. And that's, break this down into 2 parts too, but it's primarily asking good questions. What, where, when, why questions. So I mentioned that we're going to start building sailboat. Now, I've never built a manufacturing facility before. It's completely out of the norm for me. It's an idea that was inspired from meeting new people and talking to new people. I made friends with a guy who had a charter sailboat company. I made a small investment in that company. Things were going well. And he was complaining to me about how he can't buy more boats because no one's manufacturing the type of boat he wants. And I thought, And he said, I think we should build them. And I went, you're crazy. And then he kept asking good questions, and we dug down and we found out why people aren't building them, what the reasons are. We figured out about the Jones Act that you alluded to earlier. We figured out about material constraints and design constraints and market supply constraints. And then also a lot of other things like taxes and liability issues. And we just kept asking a lot of really detailed questions and got to a more and more nuanced thing to where we're like, you know what, this actually would work. But we got to do it in Puerto Rico because there's tax incentives there that'll mitigate some of those costs, and we'll get some recycled material credits, and we can source some of the materials there, and the labor pool's available. And, so we're able to narrow it down by asking really good questions. And so I think that's the first step in taking the right action, is figuring out what that right action is, because you don't want to be the person. And in my world, in the real estate world, we go to these real estate meetups, and I'll see some people that have been coming to the same meetup for 10 years. And they say they're a real estate investor, but they still haven't bought their first piece of real estate. But they have business cards, and they have a website, and they have T-shirts, and all
saying that they're an investor.
They're a real estate investor, and they're taking action. They're just not taking the right action. You don't want to be that person, right? There's nothing wrong with creating momentum by doing some of those things, but you need to have a really good plan. And that's the second part of taking the right action, is like actually stepping away after you ask those questions and figure out what the next step is. Come up with a general idea, a master plan for where you're going. So you really got to do a really nice job of thinking about goals and setting the right goals. Because if you don't know where you're going, you're probably going to get there, but it's not going to be where you want to go, And I mean, there is something about taking massive action that's useful. I always look at the example of a rocket ship, right? If you want to launch I guess it's controversial to talk about Elon Musk now, but as we sit here right before the election, but if you want to launch a rocket ship to the International Space Station, or even to the moon, right? It doesn't matter. But you want to launch a rocket ship somewhere. The first thing you have to do is put a ton of force behind it to get it into orbit. If you miss by 12,000 miles the International Space Station, but you make it into orbit, it doesn't matter if you burned up 90% of your fuel getting there, because you can make that adjustment to get to the right place. So the first thing is you do have to take action. That's the Richard Branson, take action without all the possible information, and then make the adjustments as you go. And that's part of it. But if you point your rocket down towards the center of the Earth and take massive action, you're not getting to orbit. So you need to know where you're going generally first. You don't need to be super specific. And you also need that specific goal, though, because otherwise you won't know generally which direction to go, right? So you need both. You need to know what actions make sense to take first, but you also need to have that ultimate goal in mind. And so really it's a two-part thing. And we do that with our goal setting events now. We bring people in and we go down and we create a plan. We really take them through the whole formula. I mean,
you have one coming up in December, right?
I do, in Puerto Rico too. So if people want to come to Puerto Rico, I'd be happy to have you. In fact, I didn't even tell you this offline, but I will give your listeners a 50% off code.
Oh, wow.
The current code expires November 8th. So I have to be a little careful. I'll give you a different one. No bad days. So if you use the code no bad days, that'll give you 50% off of the goal setting event.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah,
we'll make sure we put that in the link description too.
Yeah, for sure. And the website's extraordinarylifeevent.com, extraordinarylifeevent.com. We'll give you 50% off if you sign up before the event. Anyway, it's in San Juan, Puerto Rico. What's great about San Juan for people, and this is something I know but a lot of people don't realize, is you don't need a passport to come there. It's just a domestic flight if you're a U.S. citizen. So if you're somewhere in the U.S., you can fly there, but it's also ridiculously affordable to get there. I looked at it. So the event is December 6th and 7 and 8. So it's a Friday, Saturday, Sunday in San Juan. If you live in Atlanta, you can get the tickets for $200 round trip. If you live in Boston, it's like $250 round trip. New York, $200 round trip for that weekend. Yeah. I mean, it's crazy, right? Like most people think, oh, I can't afford both. I say you can't afford not to. You need to make 2025 your best year ever. And that's really what the goal setting event's about. It's about creating a pathway to an extraordinary life.
Absolutely. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for sharing all this. For our listeners, if you want to get in touch with Jeff and follow up and make sure 2025 is your best year ever, Jeff, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I mean, the best way to get in touch with me is still probably just to go on Instagram at Jeffrey Holst. But right now, sort of to support our goal setting event, we have a thing. We stole this from, this controversy floating around Project 2025. So we made our own version of Project 2025, which is like a mini version of our goal setting retreat. I'm going to go ahead and give that away for free. So I don't have the link handy, but we'll make sure it's in the show notes for you. Yeah. And you can just go ahead and log in and you'll get your own short form blueprint for 2025. So if you can't make it to Puerto Rico, at least you can get some of the value from that.
Awesome. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure hearing your story and these great, insightful tips, Jeff. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.